This is Duke University.
So I have some questions that I'm thinking through in my two projects on racial icons, which is coming out in a couple of months, and then a book that I'm currently writing on prison arts and activism. And so the questions broadly are: how have social media activism and grassroots organizing created visual material and archives to enact Black life as matter? How do we mobilize the dead and the erased to reveal the lived experiences of Black subjects? From campaigns that deploy the posthumous icon as a badge of collective solidarity and a demand for recognition to the visual and archival practices of millions who live in carceral institutions. How does the dead come to life? The unseen claim recognition and the disregarded form circles of love and hope through this declaration. And so my focal point today is material that we are all very familiar with. And I'm doing this to think through the production of the icon, and I hope you will join me on a journey into what is familiar and what's hopefully not so familiar. And so it is the collective mourning that takes place around the posthumous icon as a mode of Black artfulness and survival. And here I focus on the production of the icon through the I Am Trayvon Martin campaign. And first I want to pause to honor Sabrina Fulton and Tracy Martin and their families and all who nurtured and influenced Trayvon, everyone who touched him and recognized him and who give us permission to claim him as we have claimed him in our public awareness campaigns since his death. And in writing as mourning in this event as a performative act of breathing life into the dead, of inhaling and exhaling the arrested breaths of Trayvon Martin, Jordan Davis, Renisha McBride, Michael Brown, Eric Garner, and the many, many others, I enact a mode of racial belonging that is conflicted in its use of substitution and at the same time cathartic in its attempt to make visible and perform a long and continual process of grieving racial violence and morbidity. In Black iconicity hinges on a relationship between veneration and denigration, and it's this twinning that shapes the visual production and reception of Black American icons. Life, one of the many reasons why Black subjects turn to the sacred, venerate the dead, appeal to forces beyond the material, speak to and for the unseen, credit a deity for everyday and out-of-this-world miracles in racially inflected ways specific to local and diasporic communities, is for one very basic reason: to declare, in spite of evidence all around us to the contrary, that Black lives matter. Matter to have a mother, to make an archive, for one's life and death to have material consequences. What we know: on February 26, 2012, Trayvon Martin, a 17-year-old Black American teenager, was killed while walking back to the home of his father's fiancée from a neighborhood convenience store in Sanford, Florida. George Zimmerman, a neighborhood watch guard, noticed Martin walking, followed him, confronted him, and ultimately shot and killed him. After noticing Martin from his vehicle, Zimmerman called the Sanford police and reported that Martin was acting suspiciously and that he looked, quote, like he's up to no good, or, quote, he's on drugs or something. Zimmerman identified Martin's hoodie, a sweatshirt with a hood, as one of the features that marked Martin as suspicious. According to public records, the dispatcher told Zimmerman to remain in his vehicle and that an officer would be sent to investigate. However, Zimmerman, as the saying goes, and as the history of American vigilantism and racism reveal, took the law into his own hands and pursued Martin nonetheless. By the time the dispatch police car arrived, Martin was lying in a pool of his own blood, fatally wounded. It was not until the next day that Martin's father, Tracy, would learn of his son's fate. When the teenager was not home by the next morning, he contacted the police to file a missing person report. Shortly thereafter, the officers arrived at Tracy's fiance's home. They showed a photograph of a dead Trayvon Martin and asked if this was his missing son. With little inquiry or investigation, the killing was quickly filed as self-defense by the Sanford Police Department under Florida's notorious justifiable use of force statute, most commonly known as Stand Your Ground law. Despite the fact that Sanford police questioned the credibility of Zimmerman's account of the events, Zimmerman was released under the law, Even though the case was initially dismissed, these spare facts no one disputes: that Trayvon Martin was a black boy walking home, that Zimmerman deemed him suspicious, and that Zimmerman killed him. The story of that tragic winter's night in Central Florida does not end there, although Martin's life did. While the local authorities readily dismissed the case, Martin's death reached international attention, in large part due to the commitment of his parents to seek justice for their son's murder. Their efforts were aided by the viral transmission of information through the internet and the strategic use of Martin's image as part of their campaign. In fact, many people learned about Martin's death through online petitions that were posted on Facebook and other social media sites, demanding that Sanford's district attorney office bring charges against Zimmerman. The outcry and protest of millions, including several high-profile celebrities and public figures, led to an inquiry by the Department of Justice and eventual charges against Zimmerman. A prominent strategy to garner awareness of Martin's death was the circulation of photographs of him as an ordinary teenager. I place ordinary in quotation marks because there is little doubt that a black teenage boy is never seen as ordinary American, let alone ordinary child who deserves protection and guidance of adults and public authorities. Nonetheless, the photographs used in awareness campaigns by supporters of justice for Trayvon are striking and compelling, given the context of his death and the state's effort to absolve his murderer. One photograph, I'm going to go back, used in protests is a black and white self-portrait by Martin, known as a selfie in the social media landscape. The selfie is a form of representation that intimately projects how one wants to be perceived by an audience, especially among one's peers in the digital media realm. The selfie is a contemporary form of vernacular photography, the most widely practiced genre of photography since its inception. In its everydayness and the ease of access that consumers have to photographic software and technology in this contemporary era, the selfie makes self-portraiture a more common practice than any other period in history. Although it often appears fleeting and can be erased in an instant by digital technology, the selfie is nonetheless part of the storied genre of portraiture. Like other portraits, the selfie is a deliberate representation of a public persona, a mode of self-conscious sitting in front of a photographic lens. Whether playful, sensuous, earnest, or aspirational, the selfie suggests a desire for recognition. It is a request for acknowledgement and appeal to be a subject of value. And in this now famous self-portrait, Martin looks down into the lens with one shoulder raised as if he is leaning. He wears a hoodie. The lighting from above and the cap shaping his face create a halo effect. In the sheath provided by the hoodie, Martin's face appears to float. He hovers and levitates as his eyes peer out from under his hood. The affect is that of a foreshadowing, a speaking to audiences from the silence of death. Even as it feels as if it were a sort of premonition, Martin's selfie is also a performance of presence. He is, at that moment, alive, self-documenting, and archiving his presence for meaning and circulation. His downward tilted eyes avoid contact, and yet they reveal an inquisitive gaze. The ordinary boy has captured an image of himself that, after his murder, circulates as a posthumous icon. The boy, who died in large part due to a look that rendered him suspect in public, becomes venerated through a self-image that captures that very look. With this singular photograph, we see how image and context work together to produce a racial icon. As lethal and vile as racial intolerance and racial violence are, the forces of love, recognition, and the pursuit of justice are crucial to the emergence of Martin as icon. We, as a public, know of Martin's harrowing fate because of the courage and dedication of his parents, who began an online campaign through a petition demanding the arrest of Zimmerman. The parents' efforts led to other marches and protests through the embrace of Martin's photograph as part of the Justice for Trayvon campaign. We witness the emergence of an iconic photograph, but we also isolate an iconic form, the hoodie. Here is David Hammond's very well-known sculpture in the Hood, 1993. The hoodie, one that has resonated in public culture for years, but that has become more complexly articulated in the wake of Martin's murder. The hoodie is an article of clothing identified with a generation of urban Black young men, and for Zimmerman and many others, it is a marker of Black criminality. This article of clothing is steeped in the history of racialized style in the United States in ways similar to the zoot suit of the 1940s. The zoot suit, too, was linked to racialized violence and the criminalization of Black and Latino youth who wore the suit in defiance of wartime white patriotism. Invoking the slang term hood, as in Black and Latino poor and working class neighborhoods, as well as the functionality of a hood attached to a sweatshirt or jacket, the hoodie acquired popularity through its association with hip-hop culture and urban Black athletic wear, starting in the late 80s. The use of Martin's hooded selfie, and campaigns for justice led to a form of protest in which millions of people in countries around the world donned hoodies, posed before a camera, and proclaimed, "I am Trayvon Martin." The protest took place on multiple platforms, at rallies small and large across the country. Groups showed up in hoodies with signs declaring, "I am Trayvon Martin," or "Justice for Trayvon Martin," "We are Trayvon Martin." Selfies were posted on personal pages of social media networks with members hooded, somber, and staring into the camera. Others used a black and white silhouetted graphic of a male profile and hoodie. The Miami Heat basketball team took a group photograph of the team hooded with heads bowed. Protesters who claim, "We are Trayvon Martin," were politically, racially, ethnic, linguistically, geographically diverse. They were representative of how complexly heterogeneous the 21st century American public is. The protest portraits, in this case, express an indefinite dynamism and multiple embodiment of racial iconic form, even in its tragic outcomes. The reaction of many to Martin's death registers subtle and enormous changes in the United States that can only be briefly sketched out here. It marks the profusion and rapid circulation of representation in the contemporary era. The number of photographs produced has mushroomed largely because of the accessibility and relatively low-cost digital cameras embedded in portable consumer devices. The impact of digital photography continues to expand with the growth of photo-sharing sites. In addition, the Justice for Martin protest speaks to changing perceptions and reception of the icon and what it means to have staying power in a cultural climate where the consumption of images occur more often involuntarily and with such rapidity and plenitude that it makes it challenging to hone in on a singular image. Furthermore, these photo-based protests signal generational and racial shifts among many Black and non-Black protesters. Masses of protesters imagine and temporarily identify with Blackness in ways that are not through minstrelsy, slumming, or parody. Instead, one could argue that these images symbolically demonstrate an identification with racial isolation, profiling, and forms of abject suffering associated with certain groups of Blacks and other vulnerable populations in this country and elsewhere. In this light, many non-Blacks are able to recognize a young Black male as a sympathetic character, as one with whom they form a deeply emotional and performative attachment, a type of claiming, and to see the machinations of structural and quotidian racism to portray him as other. The emotional waves of identifying with Martin reached the White House, whether rooted in perceived or actual public pressure or a personal sense of shared experience of racial profiling. President Barack Obama felt compelled to link his life outcomes to those of Trayvon Martin. A month after Martin's death, the president spoke publicly about the killing of Martin. Many have argued that, as president, Obama has been cautious in speaking about race because of the expectations of many that he should address the significance of race in the nation's past and present. After growing tensions about Martin's murder and pressures from the public to see justice in Florida, Obama went on record stating, quote, "If I had a son, he'd look like Trayvon," end quote. The president's words affirm what many sympathetic to Martin's parents felt. For some on the front lines of protesting, there was cautious hope that Obama would be more vocal and active in his stance against racism. Contrarily, he was widely criticized by politically conservative commentators and constituents and was accused of race baiting. Yet even still, after the acquittal of George Zimmerman, Obama seemed to identify even more closely with Martin. He spoke of his own experiences of being racially profiled and then stepped into the dead boy's shoes claiming, "Trayvon Martin could have been me." His statement both led some to question what connects Obama to a 17-year-old boy who died so violently, so painfully outside of a gated community in Florida, and helped to ensure that that boy's iconic status. Obama's assertion seems even more intentionally jarring, given how very different the backgrounds and outcomes of their lives are. What Obama was signaling was an affective kinship that linked him to Martin in a racial fraternity of being marked as public threats and being subject to extreme forms of violence because of that marking. As much as the I Am Trayvon campaign and the identification with Martin among broad sectors of Americans, international protesters, and the President of the United States signal important shifts in the American public culture, they also raise troubling questions. Digital media make it easy to substitute and circulate oneself in place of the subject of racial violence. And the hooded selfie became a popular way to claim a progressive politic with minimal efforts. The millions of portrait protests and statements taking on Martin's identity are discomforting in this form of substitution. Simply put, none of the hooded protesters is Trayvon Martin. They are not the dead son of Sabrina Fulton and Tracy Martin. They are alive, and their future outcomes are yet to be determined. As troubling as I find this campaign, I do take part in this affective movement of a large number of American and international publics in the face of Martin's murder. And here the word public seems to be rightly used as it is defined, an imagined group who will never in fact meet each other. In addition to such highly personalized identification with Martin, another significant way that many made sense of his murder was through the framework of historic recurrence. Comparisons have been made between Martin's murder and his image and that of Emmett Till, whose battered body was captured in a photograph that also gained enormous public attention. In 1955, Till, a 14-year-old black boy who lived in Chicago, was brutally murdered by a group of white men while he visited his relatives in Mississippi. Till's murderers, Roy Bryant and J.W. Millam, were accused, but they later confessed in Look magazine. Till's torturous killing was crucial in galvanizing support for black civil rights and freedom struggles across a broad sector of national and international publics in the mid-20th century. Till's murder built awareness in large part due to his mother's refusal to let the injustice of her son's killing be rendered invisible. Mammy Till held an open casket funeral for Emmett so that all could see how her son had been brutalized. Quote, some 50,000 people streamed in to view Emmett's corpse in Chicago, with many people leaving in tears or fainting at the sight and smell of the body, end quote. Because Mammy Till allowed photographs of Emmett's funeral, including a close-up of his brutalized face, to be published in Jet magazine, his murder garnered even greater outrage. Millions were moved to action, or at least to greater support for civil rights, after viewing the images of his dead body and disfigured face that circulated internationally through print media. Considering the impact of Emmett Till's murder for Black Americans and the growth of the civil rights movement, Robin D.G. Kelley asserts, quote, the Emmett Till case was a spark for a new generation to commit their lives to social change, They said, we're not going to die like this. Instead, we're going to live and transform the South so people won't have to die like this. And if any event of the 50s inspired young people to be committed to that kind of change, it was the lynching of Emmett Till, end quote. In examining the legacy of Till's lynching and the iconic photograph of his post-mortem face, scholar Maisha Priest queries, quote, if we follow Mammy Till's insistence that justice begins at the moment we look at the body of Emmett Till and hold at once the vision of his humanity and what was done to him, a complicated and shifting model of resistance that motivated political action and political change throughout the civil rights movement, then we return to the idea that there is an avenue to justice to be found in his flesh. If so, what kind of justice might that be? Can there be a revelation of the flesh that does not further violate the body? End quote. Taking up Priest's provocation, what significance does photography play in this process of envisioning Till's humanity and journeying toward justice through his brutalized flesh? Even more, how have specific images served as vessels for various publics in different historical periods to feel Black flesh and racialized suffering? In both the cases of Till and Martin, the raw facts are that 2 Black boys were killed through acts of racial policing and terror, and their murderers were not convicted. There are also important distinctions between these cases and the time periods when they occurred. as well as key differences between iconic photographs in their reception and circulation. While the photograph of Martin lends itself to mimetic reproduction, I am Trayvon Martin, the photograph of Emmett Till does not. Martin's photograph projects a type of vitality and wellness in its typicality as self-portraiture and innocence as the self-exploration of a teenager, in contrast to the brutalized and distorted features of Till's face. In contrast, the brutalized and distorted features of Till's face are the subject of memorializing, not mimesis. His posthumous face serves as transparent and horrifying visual evidence of racial violence targeted at Black boys and men. Thus, we cling to Martin's iconic image and identify with him, and we hold Till's iconic image at a distance, feeling the weight of its gravity and hoping to avoid its outcomes. It is not an exaggeration to write that in the weeks and months after Martin's killing, many millions of people clung to the selfie of him in a hoodie. The attachment to Martin and his image, its significance to how various constituents of Americans, the American populace understand racialized embodiment, racial violence, and lack of access to the public sphere grew more palpable during the struggle to have Zimmerman prosecuted for his murder. In the days and weeks after Martin was killed, and without any public prosecutorial action, protest and identification with him grew even more urgent. Six weeks passed from Martin's death until special prosecutors announced charges of second-degree murder against Zimmerman on April 11th. The shift from the Sanford Police Department's initial response to the killing of Zimmerman's indictment was solely a result of the widespread public pressure from local, regional, national, international realms to see Zimmerman prosecuted. It is not an overstatement that protests and public opinion in support of justice for Trayvon led to charges against Zimmerman. After Zimmerman was charged, the route to justice for Trayvon lay in the hands of a trial jury. While his role as Martin's killer was clear, the question remained whether Zimmerman would be held accountable by jury. Even more of a concern was whether the jury would hold the same biases that Zimmerman held about the murdered boy because of Martin's race, youth, and fashion. During the trial, in the blogosphere and other media outlets, much was made of the testimony and treatment of Rachel Gentile, the teenage friend of Martin, who was speaking to him by cell phone when Zimmerman approached. Gentile was widely dismissed and disparaged because of her use of urban vernacular speech while on stand and what was perceived as her racially inflected style and a punitive pathologizing of her body. Also apparent was the lack of preparation of the prosecutors in their assumption that Zimmerman's conviction in the court of public opinion would translate to his being found guilty by a jury. At the same time that prosecutors stumbled, the defense borrowed the strategy of the Justice for Trayvon protesters by actually using images of Martin to build their case of why Zimmerman would have feared for his life when confronting Martin. Their argument was that Martin's photographic record, especially through social media, evidenced why Zimmerman would have seen Martin as suspicious and therefore why Zimmerman would have taken such extreme actions to protect himself and his community as a stand-your-ground defense. And as we know, on July 13, 2013, after 16 and a half hours of deliberating, the jury acquitted George Zimmerman of second-degree murder and manslaughter charges. Given systemic racism and injustice in this country, some scholars and critics argued that Zimmerman's acquittal was not an anomaly, but was an example of the workings of the U.S. nation as a racist state. Kelly, writes, the point is that justice was always going to elude Trayvon Martin, not because the system failed, but because it worked. Martin died and Zimmerman walked because our entire political and legal foundations were built on an ideology of settler colonialism, an ideology in which the protection of white property rights was always sacrosanct. Predators and threats to those privileges were almost always black, brown, and red, and where the very purpose of police power was to discipline, monitor, and contain populations rendered a threat to white property and privilege, end quote. So immediately following Zimmerman's acquittal, there was nonstop coverage and protests against the verdict. I, like many, especially Black mothers, felt and still feel heartbroken, demoralized, shocked, and enraged So for so many of us, the series of events around Martin's murder and Zimmerman's release with the image of Martin at the center of the protest and the trial is the reopening of a deeply painful wound. Since his death, photographs of Martin circulate as palliation and wound. In some pictures, Martin smiles. Here he floats about on paper and electronically as a thoughtful and loving child and friend. We, the sympathizers and silent majority, are encouraged to see him as an earnest, curious, sweet, and innocent. An impossible stance for a Black boy in a racial state where Blackness is by default suspicious. In a notable photograph used by protesters to untangle the visual and symbolic codes that align Blackness with deadly threat, Martin poses with his father, who hugs and kisses his son. Here, child receives recognition, protection, and guidance. This is a child who is deeply loved and cared for. Yes, a boy was murdered. We love him in all his photographic beauty, posthumously as another victim of racial violence. This boy, Trayvon Benjamin Martin, was the son of Sabrina Fulton and Tracy Martin. He was the brother of Javaris Fulton and a cousin and friend to many. He was born on February 5th, 1995, and died one terrifying evening shortly after his 17th birthday as he walked from a convenience store. There is no longer a living Trayvon Martin to flesh out what a photograph cannot contain, his corporeal presence, an experimentation with life's possibilities, a future based in childhood dreams and offspring. There will never be another indexical photograph of an embodied and maturing Trayvon Martin to complicate the widely circulating images of him, especially the photograph of a dead Black boy that circulates in his postmortem state. Trayvon Martin is a historical figure. He is a dead Black boy. He is an index. He is a specific case. He's a symbol, an icon. He is all of this and more. Martin's image has been reproduced many millions of times since he died on the sidewalk outside of a gated community. He is a goofy boy with a young female confidant, Rachel Gentile. He is an aspiring pilot. He enjoys watching NBA. He poses with grills in his mouth. There he is, posterized as a Facebook profile picture, as a flyer passed around to announce a demonstration, as a billboard, on T-shirts and hoodies. He is silhouetted. He is our baby boy whom we want to hug. He's our warning sign of what happens to Black boys. He is a threat in the minds of white paranoia. Martin's image moves through various locations and media platforms. Martin circulates as a material object, viral transmission, traumatic wound, and historical fact. He lives through his image because of our attachment to it, our attachment to the historical legacy of Blacks, to Black masculinity, and to the historical present of racial subjugation. I have never worn a hoodie in honor of Martin. At the same time, I am part of the we-making machine. But I need to imagine that there are others, many others, who share with me the abiding wish that Sabrina and Tracy had their son alive and in their arms. We intimately enfold the image of Martin, smiling from under his hoodie, into our narratives of family, belonging, and love. We publicly memorialize Martin's photograph and murder as part of the long, painful, and unfolding narrative of race violence in the American public sphere. We are not Trayvon Martin. We are alive. But through our lives, we breathe life into him, and we create matter that sustains his life. Why are we not marching as the millions of others who are terrorized, imprisoned, and killed by the structures of racial violence that devalue Black life, such as the many young Blacks who have died at the hands of other Blacks in Chicago? The indexes of those impacted are so numerous and so quotidian that we gravitate even more strongly to the singularity of the icon, the beautiful face of a Black teenage boy peering out from under his hoodie, seeking recognition. When we can isolate the image and hone in on a specific instantiation, then the emotional floodgates and the historical baggage pour out with all its weight on that one beautiful boy. And for all of its messiness, we rewrite history so that Trayvon Martin did not die alone on a sidewalk outside of a gated community. We carry his body, we wear his mask, we don the hoodie as a declaration that his life matters, that Black lives matter. And in so doing, we attempt the impossible task of breathing life into his body and returning him to the loving arms of his father and mother. Thank you.
I wonder if you could talk a little bit about David Hammond's artwork, and I'm also thinking about it in relationship to the recent cover of Claudia Rankine's book Citizen, and how the hollowed out sort of severed piece of fabric functions as palliative. Because I'm thinking, so I too sort of, am sort of torn about the sort of the occupation or inhabitation of the hoodie, right, by others after Trayvon Martin's passing, right? So what does it mean to sort of insist on a kind of substitutability, had the impossibility of that representation, but at the same time something loving about that desire to enact, like finish the walk, right, for other bodies to kind of carry his spirit in actually returning home. But I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about how this might function as a modality of veneration or as palliative.
It's interesting because I also like in this image, the sculpture from '93. I mean, it's also during a moment in the longer chapter. I just kind of make reference to the film Juice, where Tupac Shakur is hooded, and the kind of aestheticism is form, right, in many ways. But I also see this image as really haunting in its violence because of its severing. I mean, to me, it does. There's the feeling of lynching here, for me. It's just it feels quite violent in terms of the racialization of the severed hood. So I don't know if I take it as palliative. I mean, it is quite powerful. But I do, and I've been reading Rankine's poem, her book lately, and I think that we can't not untether this relationship between citizen, racialized violence, and I mean, the American citizenship is foundationally built on notions of racialized violence, and as much as we would like to untether that, it's an impossibility.
There was this moment early on that I might have misheard, but there was something about involuntary production of imagery in media.
Involuntary reception of it. So what I'm saying is, it's even more powerful that we would hone in on the image of the selfie, of Trayvon Martin's selfie, when we're flooded with so many images in our contemporary lives, right? So, I mean, you just open your iPhone or whatever to any social media site, and you just, dozens of images. So we're overwhelmed by that, which means in my study of the racial icon, it makes it even in some ways more potent that we can single in on an image given the flooding of images that is part of our, even our sleep life,
I was struck by sort of two pieces in particular. One was you were distinguishing between our capacity to kind of imagine a certain relationship of surrogation with Trayvon Martin in a way that we really was foreclosed with Emmett Till because of the kind of the way in which his body had already been occupied by these kinds of signs of racial brutality and terror. And then also the way that you really at the end made that brilliant point that the very reason that Trayvon Martin can become an icon is because it is too hard to deal with the proliferating indexes of racialized anti-Black violence. So I kind of wanted to maybe hear you think a little bit about what using that kind of second reading of Martin as like, an icon of something that is actually happening all the time everywhere, how that might trouble or might extend Kelly's reading of, Emmett Till's murder as the catalyst, as the singular sort of catalyst for a particular kind of racial justice movement. We also argue that, that the Till case was similarly an icon for a much broader index.
So because it's so overwhelming, what brings us together? And one of the things to say, why are we not all Marissa Alexander? Why there's so many other examples of where we might have some kind of sympathetic relationship too, but we don't become that. And so there is something I think potent about this plea for recognition that happens in that selfie that is really potent, that I think really, and then other images come out afterwards, but I think people really gravitated towards that initially. And I do think that visuality does speak deeply psychically to us as individuals and as publics. And I think for me, that's an example of that. So I closed this. The book is very small. It's just like 100 pages. But the opening chapter is an intro, and then there's this opening chapter about Trayvon. It's called I Am Trayvon Martin, the boy. I had the dead boy who became an icon, but I took out dead because I didn't want that for his parents. And then I conclude the coda is about the fact that so the art throughout the book is about the twinning of veneration and denigration as what animates the Black icon. But then I conclude with the to me, one of the tragedy of this country is the devaluing of young Black life. And to think about how so much of our freedom struggles are about the sacrifice. Like, there were young people protesting. We forget, these were teenagers. They were kids. And so much of our notions of freedom, are like contemporary culture, sexual politics, are actually, it's built on the labor of young Black bodies. And we continue to deny them a type of citizenship. So I start with Trayvon's death, and that's the code of all these living, unrecognized folks who are really laboring, who are creating the possibility, the freedom dreams, right, are really, it's the laborings and the emotions of, and so I talk about the dream defenders. Can we dream together? I mean, what an amazing question to ask. Can we dream together, as a really important kind of provocation?
The thought that troubles me is to what extent we can move towards an issue that you mentioned in your presentation. I think it was a quotation from Priest, where you can look at an avenue to justice found in the flesh. And I found that kind of a way into going beyond the Black bodies that are found within the United States, but trying to think through the racialized flesh that exists more on a global optic. The image in my mind that is present today is the young Yemenian who was dreaming of drones, and he was a third member of his family to be killed, and it so happened that his image and a videotape was taken, which reflected his final moments. Well, not his final moments, but before he was killed. And I think that there's a circulation of a certain kind of racialized violence that attacks the flesh. It not necessarily rooted in the peculiarity of the sorts of Trayvons that can emerge within an American space, but that is still linked to it, but is more than it. So I was wondering if you felt that in trying to interrogate the politics of justice, if it wasn't necessary to, in some sense, step outside of a certain geography of Blackness to link other spatial dynamics which create this racialized flesh.
On racial icons is specifically about how Black iconicity circulates in American publics. But American publics clearly is a part of a global publics, and I use publics plurally. Now, I'm reading right now Donna Jones' work on race and vitalism, and also Javius Viscus. So I'm definitely thinking about conversations around the human and life as I think about these notions of Black Lives Matter. But we can go to critical theory, but we can also just go to the Black vernacular and Black history that were throughout. There's this assertion, this declaration, aren't I a woman, right? That I am a man, so this is this constant claiming of one's, of a type of life, a possibility that all the evidence around us denies that, so that I'm interested in not just what's happening in terms of the academic conversation around it, but this is resonating throughout our history and our present moment, and I think every time a young Black person takes a selfie, that is a declaration of Black Lives Matter. And I don't care I don't care if it's they're throwing up a gang sign or whatever. I think every selfie is a declaration of that. And so I'm curious about how those then circulate in different kinds of ways, locally, nationally, and transnationally. I definitely think that what you're saying about flesh and as a type of global currency, and as like the kind of global, a larger discourse around it is absolutely true. But I also think there's nothing wrong with looking at a specific case of Trayvon Martin and really honing in. For me, what I was interested in doing in this project is seeing how does iconic form get produced, and what are the kind of affective registers of producing iconic form. And I asked people to send me images from Trayvon Martin protests, and it was amazing how many of those protests were international protests. Now I got, people sent me images from Ireland, from like where people were identifying, where they were claiming they were wearing hoodies and saying, "I am Trayvon Martin." So there is also something very specific about the victim of American racialized violence that becomes this a kind of global sign of a fight against larger racial structures.
I mean, I like very much the way that you staged the selfie as in a sense a kind of contemporary extension of the I am, the one representing the many, or the one standing for the many, and which is in some ways it could be, there's a parallel in the plural as well, that we are all whatever it is, we are all Charlie Hebdo, I am Charlie Hebdo, there's that kind of, or we are all Palestinians, there are various moments of these kinds of affiliations. And so I'm curious, that there is that old relationship between Pierce iconicity and indexicality, and I'm just wondering where that is in your thinking about this, and whether indexicality has a different kind of political implication or trace in
these are not always liberatory movements, right? I mean, this is in one registers quite violently as a kind of state cooptation too, and to me, a premonition of more violence to come. That Je suis Charlie is, very much that. But yeah, indexicality in this. I play with icon and index in a lot of my work. Because I do think that the way that icon and public culture gets written about, often race is something that's tacked on, and I'm interested in that iconicity and its very production. It's racialized, right? And part of what the icon did, and why it's so potent, especially in American public culture, is because the indexes are overwhelming, and I mean the indexes of the markers of racialized violence, the in every kind of way. So we can think about economic markers, we can think about educational markers, we can think about criminalization. And so I'm using index in that way to think about the markers of the forces of racialized violence are so overwhelming that it makes us claim that icon even more. When we start to think about the nuances of the ways that racialized violence plays out from the moment of inception to, and what racialized morbidity and outcomes look like in the most specific and broadest context, those indexes are overwhelming. So that's kind of taking it a little out of Pierce, but I do talk about that in terms of the photographic production too as an index and that. So does that answer? Yeah. So it's playing with those concepts a bit, because I also say when I talk about icon, I'm talking about image. I'm also talking about historic figures, a kind of embodied figure. Like I have a chapter on Black political leadership and looking at image production, but also kind of embodiment of the Black masculine leader.
Produced by Duke University. Online at duke.edu.